If you're at all in touch with the world of tabletop gaming, you must have felt the seismic shock that rocked the industry when it came out that Wizards of the Coast, owners of Dungeons and Dragons, are planning a quote-unquote update to the open gaming license that allowed so many other creators to make content based on Dungeons and Dragons. Without going into the fine details, the update to the OGL throws a significant shadow of doubt on the future of many D&D offshoots like Pathfinder. In response, many creators, such as Trollord Games, Kobold Press, and Paizo, the creators of Pathfinder, have decided to strike out and create their own systems, free from the heavy restrictions of Wizards of the Coast. And it strikes me that if Square Enix had any ambitions to get into the fast-growing world of tabletop gaming, their flagship RPG franchise, Final Fantasy, is a perfect fit. So I put together a list of my top 5 reasons Final Fantasy would be a great D&D system. But before we begin, my turn-based RPG, Sorcerous, is available right now on Steam. The game follows a team of apprentice mages on the trail of a sinister conspiracy through more than 60 quests, dozens of puzzles, and deadly battles. Follow the link in the description to watch the trailer and experience the magic. Right then, starting off the list with number 5. Final Fantasy is already turn-based. Now, this isn't true for every single game in the Final Fantasy series, but turn-based combat similar to the way that a round of Dungeons and Dragons plays out is a core part of many Final Fantasy games. So there's a level of mechanical compatibility between the two styles. Final Fantasy games have always emphasized a team of characters with diverse skills taking on challenges. Basically the exact same way a group of players acts when they sit down to play D&D. And honestly, honoring these turn-based roots with a tabletop game is just a great idea. Number 4. The Bestiary. Combat is a core pillar of D&D, and that means having something to fight. Over the course of so many games, Square has created an enormous number of monsters. Some scary, some funny, some cute, some weird. And it could easily fill out several full-length books, just with monster entries, detailing their skills, abilities, and how they fight. Which, having created quite a few monsters myself for various campaigns, I can say that most of the work is already done. It's just a matter of sitting down, saying, okay, what can this thing do? And how do we expect the players to fight it? Then building rule sets and special abilities around those. Finally, D&D's most iconic monsters, creatures like Mind Flayers, Beholders, and Carrion Crawlers, are stars in their own right. And Final Fantasy has its own iconic stable of monsters. Like the status effect powerhouses, the Marlboros, the more often ally than enemy Chocobos, or the utterly terrifying Tonberries, that can make excellent highlights in any D&D campaign. Number 3. Classes. One of the main features of any player character in D&D is what class they are. This not only informs on what the player does in combat, but even how they're roleplayed. And many of the jobs in Final Fantasy have equivalents to ones in D&D. Mechanically speaking, the warrior is very similar to a fighter. The black mage has a lot in common with a sorcerer. And I do mean sorcerer. One of the defining traits of the wizard in D&D is the fact that they have a huge amount of utility, an ability to swap out helpful spells when needed, whereas sorcerers are much more committed to a smaller list of spells, and those are typically the most effective at dealing damage, hence the similarities to black mage. Conversely, white mages are very similar to clerics. D&D's cleric is an extremely flexible class that can be made to do a lot of different things, whereas white mages are almost always dedicated healers. But we've seen, particularly in the MMO Final Fantasy XIV, how that role can be expanded into things like backup DPS. Oh, and of course, the Final Fantasy Paladin is very similar to the D&D Paladin. Beyond that, some of Final Fantasy's other iconic jobs have mechanics that have been explored frequently in tabletop games, such as Final Fantasy's Red Mage, a class known for having both a melee weapon and an ability to cast spells, could take inspiration from the Magus class from Pathfinder 1st Edition, which has a set of abilities based on weaving together spells in melee combat, a thing difficult to do for most normal arcane spellcasters. Oh, and it would be great for players to be able to wave around some of those iconic Final Fantasy weapons, like Cloud's ludicrously oversized Buster Sword or the iconic Gunblade. Next, reason number 2, the settings. Over the course of its many iterations, Final Fantasy has created some iconic worlds that would make for great D&D settings, like the high magic, high fantasy setting of Final Fantasy XII, Ivalice, the deliberately technologically backward Spira from Final Fantasy X, or perhaps the most iconic Final Fantasy setting of all, the city of Midgar from Final Fantasy VII. And of course, these locations come with a set of races perfect for player characters, like the Ronso and Guado from Final Fantasy X, the Banga and Viera from Final Fantasy XII, or even the evergreen Moogle for players looking for something a little more playful and precocious. Now we're on to my number 1 reason why Final Fantasy would be a great D&D system. The stories in Final Fantasy are character-driven. Now, think about this one for a second. Most every Final Fantasy story is about a group of characters. Almost exactly like the kind of stories that naturally come out of games of D&D. One of the best parts of being a DM is just sitting back and watching the characters interact with each other, form relationships, fight, and do all the things that those conflicting personalities are naturally going to do. Players in a D&D game share triumphs and tragedies, all brought on by the roll of the dice. This theoretical Final Fantasy tabletop RPG could even go into territory pioneered by other tabletop systems like Powered by the Apocalypse, which puts actual rules, benefits, and statistics behind character development and the formation of relationships between characters. In the past few years, tabletop gaming has grown rapidly, with the popularity of shows like Stranger Things and Critical Role, the explosion in game streaming on sites like Twitch, and the ease of playing with your friends online with services like Discord. But this recent decision by Wizards of the Coast with the OGL has significantly shaken the status quo. If you're at all a fan of D&D, or tabletop games in general, we're certainly in for a lot of exciting and scary changes in the future. Thank you for watching my 5 reasons Final Fantasy would be a great D&D system. Now, until Square gets around to giving us an official Final Fantasy tabletop, there are a lot of really cool fan-made systems that will allow you to try out some of the iconic races, classes, and settings of Final Fantasy at your next tabletop game night. They can be found with a little searching online. I've left a link to the Final Fantasy XIV D&D Compendium on GM Binder in the description of this video. It's got some great stuff in there, covering races, classes, and spells. Inspired by the Final Fantasy MMO, Final Fantasy XIV. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and say so in the comments. And if you're interested in more coverage of anime, comics, and role-playing games, follow Sector 913 on YouTube or BitChute. Finally, if you enjoy the content I cover here, check out Sorcerous, a dark fantasy mystery RPG available right now on Steam. Follow the link in the description to watch the trailer and experience the magic.